All right, how are we doing at the 11 a.m. today? So we are starting a brand new series, and I just thought this was the perfect time to launch something brand new personally, like what better Sunday, and I am so excited about this. So as we start this new series, it just makes sense that I would launch my brand new meme coin that I want to let you guys know about. Limited time only, today only. You want to jump on this? Never mind. I'm not doing it. Everybody was doing it, so I just thought I should get in on it. So I'm not doing that, but we are starting a brand new series called Money Talks. And the whole idea is if your money could talk, which you probably don't want it to, what would it say? And assuming that like our money was trying to help us, that's a big if, and had our best interest at heart, like what would our money say? I think for a lot of us, we wouldn't be surprised, right? We kind of, I think, would respond with, yeah, I know, you don't need to tell me, I get it. You know, we think back to different decisions we made, or yeah, I should have known, or no, I shouldn't have. You don't need to, rehash the details of my financial decisions. So I don't think it would be like a shocker what our money would say if it talked to us. I think we just kind of already know. I think what would be a shocker, though, is how much what our money would say paralleled something that Jesus did say in the New Testament. So this is a really interesting fact, maybe this is a shocker to you, that Jesus talked about money in the Gospels more than he talked about heaven. In fact, Jesus talked about 30 plus parables, which were stories he told because he's a master storyteller, and 16 of those were about money or possessions. And I think there's a reason for this. Like if for some of you today, if you showed up, not in terms of maybe order of importance when you can step away from the emotion, but if you showed up today just from like a visceral emotional reaction, some of you would have more of a visceral emotional reaction if I said there's no money in your bank account, no money in your retirement, you are cleared out. You would have a more emotional reaction to that than if I got up here and said there was no heaven. You're like, well, I'll worry about that later. Like I'm feeling fine right now. But no money, because it's so emotional and we're so tied to the moment. But Jesus talked about this a ton. And as much as he talked about it, what's interesting, he's never asked for it, except for one time when he was doing a little illustration. But he never asked for money. But what he said about it was such a big deal. And he said something really practical that has such a bearing on our lives and how we live our lives. So with that, let's just jump right in. If your money could talk, which again, you may not want it to, but if your money could talk, here's some of what it would say, I think based off of what Jesus would say. And the first thing is this: I can add meaning to your life, but I'm not the meaning of life. And I think for a lot of us, like we know that, we adhere to that already. Maybe when you're honest, there's been seasons where we get that backwards. And again, we wouldn't say it out loud, but it kind of becomes the chief aim of what we're going after. And isn't it true for a lot of us? Man, that season, it overpromised and under-delivered. But your money would tell you, I can add meaning to your life, but I'm not the meaning of life. In fact, I think your money would tell you, hey, just a heads up, when you get to the end of your life, they're not giving me any airplay at your funeral. I think your money would be a little upset because as much as you obsess about your money is not going to be talked about at the end. Nobody ever talks about their investments or 401k or what they did or that business deal. In fact, your money would tell you that it is a terrible means to an end. It's meaningful, but it's not the meaning of life, and it is not the means to the end. In fact, the way to make money meaningful or to use money to be meaningful is to use money as a means to an end that is bigger than you, that has a bigger purpose, that goes beyond just this little moment. In fact, this is just true about life, that to make anything meaningful in life, it needs to be a means to an end. Being a means to an end is what makes anything meaningful, meaning it's made for something bigger. It's made for a bigger purpose. It's made for something beyond just this moment. I mean, think about how we value things that are meaningful or contribute to our lives. This is why everybody hates love bugs. They were supposed to, I think, kill mosquitoes. That's not happening. They're just destroying the paint on your car. We hate them. We can't think of any tangible benefit they give. So it's just like they're meaningless. Because for anything to be meaningful, it needs to be a means to an end, to have a purpose bigger than itself. And so here's the reality for all of us, that if you want your life to be meaningful, if you want your life to be lived beyond just kind of the here and now, you have to figure out a way to allow and leverage your life to be a means to an end that is bigger than you, that has a bigger purpose than you, that's going to outlast you. And here's the thing, when you determine that your life is going to be a means to an end, your money becomes a means rather than an end as well. This is all about what are you going to leverage your life for? Like, what's going to be the vision for your life? What do you want out of, specifically, if you're a God follower or Jesus follower, what God has planned for your life? And when you begin to do this, you will see your resources and your money and your stuff as a tool to be leveraged for a greater purpose. And yes, it adds meaning to your life, but it's not the meaning of life. Now, if you're not a Jesus follower, you don't have to do anything with this or anything that Jesus says because you're not a Jesus follower. But take Jesus seriously and it'll make your life better. And hopefully maybe somewhere along the way, you'll start to believe he actually is the Son of God. But if you're a Jesus follower, this is what Jesus teaches all throughout the Gospels and all throughout his ministry. In fact, one time he told a specific parable around all of this, and Luke records it. And this is one of those parables where it's like, did he actually say that? And Jesus had multiple of those kinds of parables. And so he told this story one day to get everybody on the same page, and then he kind of makes his big point. And here's the thing about a parable. A parable is an untrue story that's used to illustrate something that's true. And Jesus was a master storyteller, so he used this technique all the time to get everybody on the same page and then lead them to a point that literally is going to transform their lives if they take it seriously. So here's what happened. One day, Jesus is with his disciples and these religious leaders, and he starts to tell them this story, that there was a certain rich man who had a manager handling his affairs. And one day, a report came that the manager was wasting his employer's money. So this is just real world, real life. This guy had so much money and so much wealth, he couldn't manage it all. So he had probably multiple money managers. They invested for him. They did deals on his behalf, but they had to keep all of his affairs and estate and money kind of operating properly, and they were supposed to steward it properly. And he gets word that one of his managers is not managing his money well. He's being shady. He's not making good investments. And so when the employer hears about it, here's his response. He called him in and said, "What's this I hear about you? Like, you're not repping me well. Yeah, like I've given you assets that I want you to manage well. I want you to invest well. I want you to steward well. And it doesn't feel like you're doing that. So get your report in order because you're going to be fired." Basically, go get one of those little boxes because you're going to clean out your cubicle. Get your books in order. And then we're going to have an exit interview because you haven't done what I asked you to do. I gave you opportunity. I gave you something to steward, and you just haven't stewarded it well. You haven't taken your opportunity and leveraged it well. So because of that, you're going to be fired. And so the manager thought to himself, and this is the key word, now what? Like, I haven't done what I was supposed to with what I was given. And so now I got to figure out what's next for my life. I got to figure out what's next for this season. I got to figure out what I'm going to do. And so now what? My boss has fired me, and I don't have the strength to dig ditches. I mean, I'm like cubicle sitting, khaki wearing. I bring lattes in the morning. I can't dig ditches. And I'm too proud to beg. So I've got to figure out, okay, I've got a limited amount of opportunity, and I've got a limited amount of time, and I've got to figure out how to leverage it for what's next in my life. And this guy, this manager, starts to think through what he hadn't previously thought through because now the urgency's there. And if I don't do something, I'm not going to have a job. If I don't figure this out, if I don't think through what is next for me, then I don't know what I'm going to do next. And then it says he gets an idea. He's like, I know how to ensure that I'll have plenty of friends who will give me a home when I'm fired. So he invited each person who owed money to his employer to come in and discuss the situation. So this guy, like, he has a lot of assets, a lot of money, a lot of investments, his employer. So there's a lot of people that have debt, a lot of people that owe money. And so the manager's like, I'm just going to call him in. I'm not going to tell my boss about it because I'm about to get fired anyway. I got nothing to lose. So he starts to call in all of these people that have debts that they owe his employer. So he calls them in, he invites them in, and go to the end of that verse. He invites them in to discuss the situation. And so he asks the first one, how much do you owe me? But basically, like, what's the outstanding debt that you have? And then it says that the guy told him, I have 800 gallons of olive oil. So the manager told him, take the bill and quickly, like, I don't have a lot of time. I'm actually keeping this on the down low, so don't tell anybody about it. But quickly change it to 400 gallons. Now, he doesn't tell anybody what he's doing. He doesn't tell his employer what he's doing because, again, he's desperate. He's just got to figure out how he can keep his job. And suddenly, he is more aware of his time and his opportunity than he was in the previous season. And this is the point where, because Jesus is a master storyteller, he gets everybody to kind of feel the tension. Because some in the crowd like you are like, well, that's not fair. Like, you had 800 gallons, you cut it to 400 gallons. Like, it's irresponsible. Like, I don't know if you should be doing that. But Jesus is doing what Jesus set out to do. He has created tension, and he's got everybody's attention. And so he cuts the bill in half. And the thing is, no matter what the people listening to Jesus thought, here's the point of the story. This guy who had his debt cut in half says to the manager, hey, thank you very much. If you ever need anything, give me a call. And so the manager goes away, and then he meets another guy, and he asks him the same question, like, what do you owe? He says, I owe 1,000 bushels of wheat, was his reply. And the manager said, take the bill. I'm only cutting yours by, a lesser percentage, but change it to 800 bushels. And the implication is that he just brought people in one after another, and they had conversations, and he would slash what they owed and try to get as much as he could around what was owed his employer. And then it says that what happened next was the rich man. And everybody who's listening to Jesus, real quick, again, Jesus has created tension, and he has everybody's attention because they're thinking, how is this guy going to respond? Like, he just fired the guy, told him to pack up his cubicle. He's out of a job, and now this manager goes behind his back, calls all of these people in without permission, begins to kind of figure out how he can slash what they owe in order to be a better use of the time and opportunity he has for the sake of his employer, but he never tells his employer. So everybody's kind of holding their breath. What's the rich man going to do? And in the parable, Jesus says, the rich man, I love this, had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so what? So shrewd. Basically, and this is the surprise to the crowd who's listening to Jesus' story, he like fist bumps the guy. He's like, well played, good job. They laugh and walk away. Because for the first time, and I guess the guy saved his job, for the first time, the manager starts to think differently about everything. That I've been given a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity, and I didn't realize it until I was about to be fired for not managing it well. But I've got to figure out how to leverage this. And so his employer basically gave him props for forward thinking, looking ahead, doing what he needed to do, and being a great, responsible steward of the investments and even the debts that he owed. And so he fist bumped him and walked away for being so shrewd, such a good steward, being so forward thinking and managing his assets and managing his money well. And so it says that it is true. And then Jesus stops and he pushes out of the parable. He's like, okay, I'm not telling a story anymore. And then he talks to basically us, or he talks to the disciples and the Pharisees who were in the crowd and says this. It's true that the children of this world, basically this is Jesus' term for, this is just people who live like this is all there is. They live like this life is the end of it, which if it is, man, you should drink it up. To quote Solomon, be merry, squeeze all you can out of life. I mean, you should live with the assumption that it's all for your consumption, because come on, once this life is over, it's over. He's like, but the children of this world who live like this life is all there is, a lot of times, Jesus said, they're more shrewd, they're more responsible, they're more forward thinking in dealing with the world and what they've been given than are the children of what? One more time. Like the children of light. That basically those who recognize they're followers of God, they're followers of Jesus, and they have been given an extraordinary promise that this is not all there is, that God is doing more than what meets the eye and what is right in front of you, and that literally everything you do, even though we don't understand it, your time, your priorities, your decisions, what you do with your wealth and your money and your stewardship, literally, it cannot be contained in this moment, but it is leading to something bigger, and that everything that you do has a bigger impact than just here and just now. And he's like, you know that this life is not all there is, and you are living for something bigger. And yet a lot of times you don't live with as much vision and shrewdness and stewardship as people who live like this life is all that there is. And Jesus' point is just this, that Jesus commended the money manager for taking full advantage of his limited time and his limited opportunity. Because the reality is, for every human being in every generation, wherever you find yourself, you have a limited amount of time and you have a limited amount of opportunity, and you at some level should do the same thing. You should ask the question, how do I leverage more of what I have, my money, my possessions, my stuff, for something that is bigger than me? And something that is bigger than my life, and something that is bigger than just this moment. And then Jesus gets even more specific as he's talking to that group in the first century, and he says this. He's like, let me just break it down for you. Here's the lesson. case you're not tracking. Use your worldly resources. Use your money. Use your wealth. Use what we ultimately believe God has placed in our hands to benefit others and make friends. Then when your possessions are gone, and by the way, when you're gone, when your possessions are gone, they will welcome you to a what? Now, he's not talking about salvation. But here's the implication, that there is something that you can do. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you're not, you should just take some of this to heart in terms of how to manage things well, and then maybe you'll come to the place to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but you don't have to do any of this. But if you're a follower of Jesus, of King Jesus, he's going, there is something that you can do with your temporary stuff that has the potential to make an eternal difference. And it doesn't mean that you don't enjoy your stuff. This is actually the pathway to enjoy your stuff, but also realize it's not just for you, and you are a part of a bigger purpose in your life. Now, here's the thing. If it wasn't for who said it, I don't know if I would buy it. Because you're like, well, this is just what religious people say, and it's probably what they say when they want your money. And like, yeah, you just leverage your stuff for something bigger than you and beyond you, and what you do now is gonna matter forever, and it's gonna make this multiplicative impact that's gonna last, and like, I don't know if I believe that. Here's the reason I believe this. And this is such a big deal, specifically if you grew up in kind of an environment where they maybe kind of created a faith argument on a house of cards. The reason I believe this is because Jesus said it. And the reason that I take Jesus seriously, that you hear me say all the time, but it's worth repeating, is because Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection and then pulled it off. And you've heard me say 100 times, if anybody looks to the future and goes, I'm gonna resurrect myself from the grave, and then does it in history, you should take seriously whatever they say about your life, your priorities, and your money, because they probably know what they're talking about. We don't believe Jesus because of the Bible. Just real quick, many of you grew up with that, and so your entire faith hinges on the Bible and getting all of your questions answered about the Bible. That was never the foundation of our faith. If there were no resurrected Jesus, there would be no Bible. If there was no resurrected Jesus, there would be no church. If there was no resurrected Jesus, there would be no Jesus followers left any longer. The reason that we believe it and take it seriously, and I've studied this now for a couple decades, is because there is overwhelming evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And anybody who rises from the dead, I think, deserves your allegiance and surrender in every area of your life. And so Jesus is like, that's why you should take me seriously. And that's why you should lean in when I talk about your priorities in your life and your future and your responsibilities and your money, because of what I did in history. And Jesus was so clear that your money is a means. Your money is a means. It's a thing. It's morally neutral. There's nothing bad about money. He's so clear about this. But it is, as we're going to see later in the series, the number one competitor for your heart and your affections and your emotions, because it's so tangible. But money is a means. It is a means to an end, to something that is bigger than you. And Jesus is like, that's how you should live your life. That's how you should view it. In fact, if this is true, it means that we shouldn't view a percentage of our income, but we should view 100% of our money, our stuff, our possessions as a means to an end for something that's bigger than us. In fact, if Jesus is right, and I think he is because he rose from the dead, if Jesus is right, it means that your temporary stuff or your kind of in the moment, right now resources have the potential to make a forever difference. And so the question really is for every Jesus follower, everybody who is at some level attempting to, I want to follow Jesus. I want to prioritize Jesus. I think because Jesus rose from the dead, he might know something about my life, that we should constantly come back to this question in every season. How can I leverage more of what I have as a means to an end that is not me? How can I leverage more of what I have as a means to an end that is not me? This is Jesus' whole teaching in his most famous sermon, Sermon on the Mount, when he said this, blessed. You heard me say this before, but literally the Greek word is happy. You want to live a happy life, go to the Sermon on the Mount. It's all counterintuitive. Nobody seems to do it. It's all kind of mind-blowing. But if you would follow it, he says, happy is the person who gives rather than receives. And the literal kind of context of that is it's great to receive, and that's a part of life. But if you want to live a happy life, if you want the fulfillment and the peace that God is inviting you into, you've got to figure out a way to answer this question and leverage more of your life and be strategic on the outset to go, how can I center my life more around giving than I do around receiving? Because again, you don't have to believe Jesus, but he rose from the dead. Jesus literally says that is the pathway to happiness. That's what I want for your life. That's what I want to invite you into. So how can I leverage more of what I have as a means to an end that's not me? Can you just say that with me real quick? I know it's long and we may get lost, but let's just try it together. And if you're new here and you wonder why people are laughing, you'll find out in a second. Say this with me. How can I leverage more of what I have as a means to an end that is not me? That was decent, so I'm just going to end on that. One of the things, I've told you this before, one of the things I'm so grateful for that gave me such a massive advantage, along with so many other things I got from my parents who were followers of Jesus and incredible examples for us, is I got this whole idea around how to handle my money. And it benefited me first just because it was practical, and I'm a practical thinker, so I just did it because I think this is going to be better for me, and it's selfish. But then later it became more of a spiritual issue as I got older, where I realized, no, this is an issue of surrender to Jesus. But my parents would just decide ahead of time that this is the percentage of income that they were going to live on. And they did that year after year, decade after decade. And then they decided, what percentage they were going to give away. And they always did it way in advance. They were never surprised by where their money went. They leveraged their life around giving more than receiving. And a lot of times they didn't have a lot. We didn't grow up with a lot. But they would constantly decide ahead of time, we're gonna pick a percentage. I cannot tell you, just from a practical level, besides the spiritual level of my heart and what God has done, I cannot tell you how much has benefited my life, my kids, my marriage. And it's never perfect for anybody, but just to have this mindset of, I'm gonna pick a percentage of my income ahead of time and decide this is what I'm gonna live on. I'm gonna pick a percentage of my income ahead of time. This is what I'm gonna give. This is what we're gonna save. Because here's the reality for all of you. And if you don't do anything else today and you're just like, I'm not doing that, and I hate it when churches talk about money, that's fine. You should just do this one thing. You should decide ahead of time what percentage of your income you're gonna live on. That's what it means to be shrewd. That's what it means to be a great steward. That's what it means to be forward thinking. Because for a lot of us in our culture and among Americans, statistics will tell you this, we don't know. In fact, we don't ever pre-decide the percentage we're gonna live on, which is why most people live above the percentage of income that they actually make. And they find out, by accident, it actually was 108% that we lived on. Or they live on 99% and then they give away 1% because it just happened to be there at the end of the year. But what if you flip that? Why don't you decide ahead of time what percentage you're gonna live on rather than allow a lifestyle to choose it for you? Because isn't this true about life? I mean, you are so moved in directions emotionally because of what you feel like you need in the moment, and you were shopping on that thing and you didn't even know it existed, but then when you saw it, you had to have it, and you got to upgrade that thing, and that thing needs to be newer, and none of that's bad, but you can end up living your whole life with the assumption it's all for your consumption. And Jesus is like, you should live different. You should live recognizing that it is a means to an end that's bigger than you. Why don't you live shrewd and forward thinking, okay, ahead of time, we're gonna decide what percentage of income we're gonna live on. And whatever answer you come up with, 100% because we just think it's all about us, that's fine, you can do that. Or we're gonna live on 90% and we're gonna save 1% and we're gonna give 1% away. Or like some of us, you're gonna live on way less than what you make, and then you're gonna give money away and you're gonna save. And many of you think it's impossible. It's not an income issue. We'll talk about later in this series. It has everything to do with a self-control issue. But Jesus is like, how do you leverage more of what you have as a means to an end that's bigger than you? One of the things, and I can't stress this enough, that early on, Nicole and I, as best we could, wanted to create margin. That when God put somebody in front of us, we could help them. And that's something that constantly we're working toward. Because if you don't plan ahead of time, here's the thing. So many of us have incredible intentions that we can't do anything with because we haven't planned in advance to live generous. I'll never forget when God dropped, this was early in our marriage, so we had no money. If any of you started out that way, and I mean, we had nothing. But we decided ahead of time that we were gonna live on a certain percentage of our income that was gonna be less than what we actually made, because if you don't, you hear me say this all the time, if you don't pre-decide certain things, your feelings will override them. And God dropped this girl into our life, and you can't do stuff for everybody that comes your way, so I'm not even advocating that, but every once in a while, just kind of go back to last week, God will place somebody in your path, and sometimes uncomfortably, and you don't want to do it, and you try to argue out of it, and you're like, I don't want to do that, and God's like, I placed them in your path for a reason, and this girl we tracked with for a while, and she was single, and she had come out of addiction, and there was a lot of mess. And we would meet with her constantly, and we would try to be there for her. And I remember at one point she was going to get thrown out. She needed $500. And again, this is my specific context and scenario. And I just knew God was going, you gotta help her out. And I was like, $500 for us at the time was like $1 million. But we had lived in such a way that we were living below the percentage of our income to be able to give it away. And I'll never forget, like, just this when you're still writing checks, and like just kind of begrudgingly almost writing that check, like, right, here you go, God. And gave this to her, and I'll just never forget that whole journey over those years. And it doesn't always work out well. I mean, sometimes God will call you to be generous and step out, and you'll do it, and you'll feel like, well, what would I even do that for? And somebody took advantage or whatever. I'll never forget one week, because we tracked with her for a while, where she was in a really bad place. My wife literally like drug her to church. I'm not recommending this generally, but again, you got to know the situation. And she was just physically, she was just even a mess. And I remember, because we had about 70 people at a time staring over at the right side of the auditorium from where I was at, and my wife was beside her, and just seeing her just physically just look like a wreck, and tears rolling down her face with her hands up in the air worshiping Jesus. And God began to do a work in her life, and not to tie a bow on it because it doesn't always work out well. Like, this is 15 years ago. God has done an incredible work in her life. And you know what? I look back and I'm like, I have no idea what I would have done with this stuff. I mean, maybe some new floors in our kitchen because we needed them. I have no idea what we would have done with this stuff. But isn't it true, many of you experiences, the stories, the emotion of those stories, you wouldn't trade for anything. Like, I even think of many of you in this room who have leveraged your life this way for people in the community, but also because you believe that the church, when it's on mission, is the hope of the world. In every environment, those of you who are part of our Reimagined building campaign, those of you who are funding environments that you may never meet the people or ever know their names, and every time you see somebody go through the waters of baptism, every time you hear a story of an adult who reconnected with their Heavenly Father when they never thought it was possible, every time mom drags her 8th grader or 10th grader to CC students and they didn't want to come at first, and then there's that moment where suddenly the light bulb comes on and they place their faith and trust in Jesus, or every person who comes to our church, we're like, I'm giving it one more shot, I'm giving it one more shot, and then God does something in their heart that transforms their life forever. And come on, if you've ever been a part of that at a personal level, you look at that and recognize, I don't know what I would have done with this stuff, but the memories and the stories will be a part of my life forever, because those stories are a part of your story for the rest of your life. Like, there's something about it that is so emotional, because we get to be a part of what God's doing and leverage our stuff for something bigger than ourselves. I mean, there's often times where Nicole and I will just literally be in tears, my wife, when we hear the story or get an email of somebody who I hated the church and consequently wanted nothing to do with Jesus. And then I was invited and something happened and everything changed for them. Or the multiple people we've gotten to know firsthand that came to a service trying to kind of get things cool with God because, in their mind, that's what they felt like they needed to do because they were about to end their life. And then they encountered something that changed everything, and they began to follow Jesus. Or an email that I got from Anna after Easter, and she was about 18 years old, and she basically said she was like an agnostic atheist, but she wasn't sure. She was somewhere in the middle. She's like, I didn't want anything to do with it. My parents don't even want me to go to church. And she's like, somehow I still have a lot of unanswered questions, but it just made sense, and I believe that Jesus is actually a resurrected king, and today I place my faith and trust in Jesus. And you walk away, man, and your emotions you're so moved by that. And every single one of us, as a follower of Jesus, you have the option of turning your stuff into stories. And here's the question that you should ask, because you have a lot of questions around, decisions that you need to make financially, but you should factor in this question. In terms of our life, do we want more stuff or do we want more stories? Do we want more stuff or do we want more stories? Do we want to leverage some of our stuff for something that is bigger than us, that's going to move beyond us, that's going to make a difference beyond our little life? Because money can have meaning if it is a means to an end that moves beyond you and beyond your little life for a greater purposes. And then Jesus says this. He wasn't done. He's like, verse 12, if you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in what? There's a direct correlation, but if you are dishonest in little things, and this is so interesting, that literally how you steward what God's given you, how you manage it, how forward thinking you are to live beyond just you, that literally it's an issue of honesty with the stewardship that God has given you. dishonesty in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And then verse 11, this verse never gets any airplay. This is such a big deal. And if you're untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who's going to trust you with the true riches of heaven? That literally, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but the promise is that the level to which you manage well and are responsible with what God has placed in your hand, there is some level of connection with what God does in your life, with the presence of God, with the power of God. Again, he's not talking about salvation, heaven. He's talking about you living, bringing God's kingdom to planet Earth and experiencing the power and the presence and the peace and the fulfillment of God. And there is a sense in which you experience that to the proportion that you are willing to surrender this area of your life to your King. And some of you know this, like there's not a one-to-one correlation, but if you want kind of to get the most out of life, there's just more that you get when you decide, God, I'm gonna surrender one of the areas that is most difficult to surrender because it's my perceived security. For some of us, it's our perceived identity, but I'm gonna surrender it to you anyway. And some of you have the story where God has shown up in unbelievable ways in your life. And I'm not talking about, well, if you give one, then God's gonna give 10. I just wanna say, I don't wanna use too strong a language. I cannot stand American prosperity theology, teaching, and yes, it'll build big churches, and you can write a lot of books, but for most of you who live in the United States of America, you already got your 10, sorry. The promise is not you give one, God's gonna give 10. The promise is when you steward well everything that God's given you to follow him, God will do something in your life, through your life that cannot happen any other way. So in essence, our money, our stuff, our possessions are a tool to leverage for something bigger than us and a test. How well are you managing what God has given you? How well are you managing the resources that God has placed in your hand? And at some level, it is a test to reveal whose kingdom are you most devoted to? And he finishes with this, Jesus' words. And if you're not faithful with someone else's property, we're like, it's not someone else's property, it's mine, I worked really hard for it. And Jesus is like, that's the problem. It's not yours. If you're faithful with someone else's property, Jesus would go, mine, everything that has been placed in your hand came from me. Who will give you property of your own? So here's Jesus' point. If your money were to talk to you, here's what it would say. Just so you know, just as a reminder, I'm still gonna be here when you're gone. And the other reminder is the moment you think that you own me is the moment that I own you. And one last one, little gut punch. We are all managers. None of us are owners. And you know how I know this? Because when you leave this world, you will leave your stuff behind. When you leave this world, you will leave all of your stuff behind. So by definition, that makes you a manager and not an owner. And we should just recognize that. In fact, that will lead us to this question, if you ever recognize that this is actually true. Who am I managing it for then? If this is true about my life, that we're all managers and not owners, which is just true, then who am I gonna manage it for? And here's the thing, if you're just the byproduct of evolutionary accident, I don't know. You should do what Solomon says. Drink, eat, be merry, save as much as you can, spend as much as you can, enjoy your life, because this is all there is. But if the scripture is true, and I think they're true because Jesus is a resurrected Savior and he pointed to the scriptures and validated their authenticity, from the beginning, God somehow created the heavens and the earth. And if you're a skeptic, don't get tripped up on Genesis. The whole point of Genesis is that God did it, not how God did that. So however it worked, if God created the heavens and the earth, if God created us as image bearers made in the image of God, if God from the very beginning, and I believe this because Jesus referenced it from the very beginning, made us stewards of this planet and he gave us a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity, if all of that is true, this makes complete sense. We should manage well. So I just want to encourage, if you're not a Jesus follower, you should do some of what I'm talking about over the next 3 weeks. And just straight up, just legit, my prayer, and it may not happen, and you can keep coming, even if you never believe what we believe, but my hope is you would begin to apply some of the teachings of Jesus, and maybe some point along the way that you would recognize that Jesus is who Jesus says he is. But this will just help your life. But if you're a follower of Jesus, If you're a follower of King Jesus, I know some of us in our kind of cultural climate, and again, you have the choice of what you want to do. We like a little Jesus on the side as long as he helps us. We're not really that, we don't really want to follow him and submit our lives to him. So maybe that's where you're at. But others of you, even as much as you struggle, there is this real desire of if Jesus is real and if King Jesus really did rise from the dead, I want to submit my life to him, but I struggle. I want to follow him. And if you do, and if you want God to move in your life and to do something powerful in your life, and you want to experience life to the full, which is what he offered, you have to begin to ask this question. Here's the question. Actually, yeah, there it is. If being a means to an end gives life meaning, to what end do you want your life to be a means? Can you just say this with me real quick? If being a means to an end gives life meaning, to what ends do you want your life to be a means? What do you want people at the end? Because none of us ever celebrate this. I talked about it in the last series. I know this is weird, or actually the first message of the year. But in my journal, I wrote a thing that's like my obituary. Not that anybody's actually going to read it. But it's just my thing to keep me focused on at the end of my life. I'm going to live in such a way, this is what I hope people say about me. Because I want such clarity of focus around who I want to be and what it looks like to follow Jesus and what I want to be true of my life in those final breaths. But we often don't think about this. But what do you want people to celebrate about you at the end? What do you want people to say about your life? What do you want people to say how you lived your life? The people who are closest to you. Some of you, if you're raising kids who are intricately aware of all your successes and failures, what do you want them to say about you? What breaks your heart? Because I bet as an image bearer of God, there's stuff that breaks your heart. What breaks your heart that you're actually doing something about? This is why, and again, I'm just gonna be really straightforward. This is why my wife and I, from the very beginning, decided we would live below our means and then we would give money away, at least 10% plus. We'd give some to the local church because I believe the church is the hope of the world when it's on mission. It is imperfect, it is flawed, but it is on mission when it's doing its job to introduce people far from God into a relationship with God and change their eternity forever. So we decided we would live our lives giving a lot of our income away to that, and then we would give into the community around real needs of homelessness and food scarcity and women in crisis. Even if some of them have been irresponsible, we recognize they are image bearers of God, and we have been called to live life, to usher in the kingdom and put other people first ahead of ourselves and live generously, even if people don't appreciate that generosity, because we are stewards of the message of good news for all people. And we shouldn't just talk about that or spit out Bible verses. We should help people by the generosity of how we live our lives, how we spend our money, how we leverage what God has placed in our hands. So we just decided early on, we would decide ahead of time, we're gonna live way below what our income actually is, that we're gonna give money away, we're gonna save, because this is what we did not want to be said of our lives. This is what we didn't want to characterize us, and I think many of you don't want either. Accumulation, consumption, upgrades, fashion, house full of stuff. Accumulation, consumption, upgrades, fashion, house full of stuff that generally is just the stuff of future garage sales. I mean, we don't want our lives to be characterized like this, that she ate and she drank and she was merry and then she was dead. Like, we don't want a story of like he worked and eventually he played golf and his handicap was still terrible, but he played it, he retired, lived it up, then he was dead. That's a life poorly lived. And yet, I'm going hard here, for some that's kind of the American dream. The American dream is terrible sometimes because it is in opposition to what Jesus said was most significant in regard to how you live your life. It doesn't mean you shouldn't play golf. I don't get it because I'm terrible at it and it's way too much money. Play golf, retire. I mean, live it up to an extent, but figure out how to leverage your life for something that is bigger than you. This is not the goal. And yet, if you never answer that question, just mark it down. Your appetites for more. I need what they have. I just saw this thing advertised on Instagram. Didn't know it existed. Now I need it. Keep up with. We need to upgrade that. It still works great, but we need another new one. Your appetites eventually will consume and eat up all of your resources. And you'll live, I know it's uncomfortable, you'll live like most Americans. And at the end of the year, you find out if you have any left to give away, or you didn't have anything to give away and now you got to crawl out of the debt, Or you saved and you earned some, but you never pre-decided how you were gonna live your life and what percentage of your income that you were gonna live on. But when you answer this big question, I'm telling you, your money will follow you. You will enjoy it more because it is a means to an end. But if you don't answer that question, you will always follow the money, and is one of the greatest tragedies of life for people who are followers of King Jesus. Because here's ultimately will characterize their life. You live for yourself, and you'll only have yourself to show for yourself, along with some stuff for people to fight over when you're gone. And they'll fight over it. You only have yourself to show for yourself. And you already know in your heart whether you submitted to it or not, because you're made in the imago Dei. You have been created to live for more than you. So how do you leverage your life to give it away, to be a means to an end that's something bigger than you? So before I pray, at the end of this series, we're doing something called Money Talks Workshop. This is just super practical, how to help in finances, because it is one of the biggest tension points in marriages and households and individuals. So this is just purely like people who know what they're talking about, how they can lead you in this area. There's so many people who feel stuck in over their head. So I just feel like as a church, we should talk about practical stuff and then give really practical tools to actually help people grow. So that's coming up at the beginning of March. I say this because this might be the next best step for you. But here's what I want you to do in the meantime, and then I want you to come back the next 2 weeks, even though it may be a little bit painful. I want you to answer this question. If being a means to an end is what gives life meaning, to what end do you want your life to be a means? I just want to encourage you. Just answer this question for your life at some point along the way. If being a means to an end gives life meaning, and it does, to what end do you want your life to be a means? So at the end of that whole interaction, it's really interesting. Jesus was talking to his disciples and religious leaders. And he got done and he was like, all right, guys, you can go. Sermon's over. And it says that the Pharisees who were there listening to Jesus dearly loved their money. And they heard all this. And they did what? They scoffed at him. Do you know their names? Nope. We don't know any of their names, as we said last week, because they missed the opportunity of a lifetime to follow Jesus and to surrender their lives. Because if being a means to an end is what makes life meaningful, to what ends do you want your life to be a means, knowing that if you're a follower of Jesus, you are a son and daughter of God, that you have been bought with a price, that you have been given a new identity, a new DNA, a new future, a new hope. You are not just living for this moment. And even if you have been a mess and you've got a past and there's dysfunction, God sees the perfection of his son and not your past and not your actions. And now he has taken you out of your brokenness and says, even with all that junk, I want you to live your life with meaning. I want you to impact people beyond just this life. I want to do something in you that's going to reverberate for all of eternity. You're not getting that offer anywhere else. And so I want you to surrender to me as I'm ushering in my kingdom to earth. I want you to bow your knee and surrender your life to King Jesus in every area, not just on Sunday when you sit in a row and sing a song. I want you to devote everything to me, because you will find meaning and you will find purpose when you live as you were created to live, as a means to an end for something bigger than you. It's something bigger than this life. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you so much for what you're doing in this moment. Give us wisdom to know what to do. Give us courage to do it. And we pray all of this in Jesus' incredible name. Amen.